Okay, we're at the top of the hour, so we'll get started. Hello and welcome. My name is Deb Swanson. I'm a faculty support consultant here at UAGC. I am pleased to host this session entitled Faculty Wellbeing, Burnout, and Coping at Three Colombian Universities. By joining us today, you acknowledge that this session is being recorded and will be shared with TLC-related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation. However, we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, we have enabled live transcription. If you would like to use it, please click on the button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now, I am pleased to introduce you to Morgan, Lily, Lesley, and their wonderful presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Deb. Well, it's very much a treat presenting at TLC on the final day of the conference with these wonderful presenters today. I think I know a lot of folks on the call, but for those that I don't, my name is Morgan Johnson, and I'm the Vice President of Academic Experience here at University of Arizona Global Campus. But I'm also a doctoral candidate in the Higher Ed Executive Management Program at University of Pennsylvania. So it's really meaningful and a privilege to be here with some of my doctoral cohort colleagues and friends. We're going to be presenting on research we conducted earlier this year together as part of the international component of our program. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lily to introduce herself.
Thank you, Morgan. So my name is Lily Zhang. I'm Morgan's classmate. In addition to be a doctoral candidate in the Higher Education Management Program at GSE, I'm also a director of advising, compliance, IT, and operations for University of Pennsylvania, Penn Global International Student and Scholar Services. I'm also going to invite my colleague and wonderful classmate, Lesley, to introduce herself.
First and foremost, good afternoon, good morning. Excuse me. I'm Lesley Massiah-Arthur. I am a doctoral candidate along with Morgan and Lily at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Prior to my deciding to do this full-time, I was the Associate Vice President and Special Assistant to the President for Government Relations at Fordham University. And now I do strategic advising in higher education policy, advocacy, and leadership. So it's my extreme pleasure to be here today. So I think let's get things started. As Morgan mentioned, this was part of our research responsibilities as part of UPenn and what we were looking at, how higher education systems work differently in other countries. And for our particular cohort, we were given the privilege and honor of going to Colombia for our international experience. Now, what made Colombia very interesting to us is the fact that Colombia's president back in 2014 made the deliberate, concerted effort to say that he wanted Colombia to be the most educated populace, to have the most educated populace by 2025. And as a result of that, new policies, new forms of thinking went into effect as to how do we bridge the gaps. And these are the questions that they were asking themselves as government entities, as higher education entities. How do we bridge the existing gaps that exist between urban and rural areas, between students that were well-to-do and those who were not, and also to having an educational system that is as diverse as Colombia's is? So we started with the initial thought. Well, we looked at what was happening here in the United States, and in particular, what happened after COVID. And what we found in our own respective campuses was that our colleagues were stressed, our students were stressed, and a lot of research was being done on how do we manage stress. A lot of political conversations were going on within the United States about mental health and the importance of supporting mental health on campuses. So starting from that basic premise, we asked ourselves, well, if that is what's happening here, and we knew that this was a global pandemic, did something to this effect occur in Colombia? Were they going through similar stressors? And more importantly, as American higher education analysts and professionals and educators, how do we interpret that experience in a way that centers the Colombian experience and one that does not allow us to be able to impose our own thoughts and ideas on the process? Because we had this in mind, by the time we went to Colombia, particularly Bogota and Cartagena, we found that there was a very powerful blend of things that came together for us. One, there was a very concerted effort to learn from the American experience. They too had seen what was happening politically, culturally, and particularly in terms of higher education and how higher education was being discussed in the United States. There was an important sense of cultural immersion. We were invited to come in not only as colleagues, but as willing learners and participants. And most importantly, people were willing to tell their stories. The human connection was extraordinarily powerful. And when we talk about things like mental health and stress and burnout, these are particularly personal things. And we're asking people to be vulnerable in sharing their experiences. And fortunately for us, we had folks and professionals and institutions that were willing to be vulnerable in the interest for their own best interest and higher good. Next slide. So, and in summary, when we looked at the research project, our question was examining faculty well-being and burnout at very distinct colleges and universities. Those who had very similar, very different histories, and in particular, missions. Where were they located? Who their audiences were? And those things helped distinguish how those faculty members viewed things like stress, and more importantly, how they coped. We also saw that faculty and administration, they're no different than what happens in the United States, meaning that faculty doesn't think that administrators know what they're doing, and administrators don't think that faculty pay attention. And those things started to come through in terms of our conversations. We move to the next slide. So in order to provide the context for what it is that we were doing, we looked at the research. And while there is some research being done with regards to burnout, there's not a lot of work that's being done specifically for Colombia. But there's some very, even though there's not a lot, those that exist is very, very powerful and very potent, particularly when it comes to areas like faculty well-being and burnout. This is a global concern. It is not something that's just relegated to the United States, and it is something that moves throughout Latin America, in particular looking at Colombia. Our study was based on lived experiences. We wanted to see what the literature, whatever there was, how applicable it was to the Colombian experience, and having faculty tell us what their experiences were, and being able to share it with us and being able to share it within their own cultural context. We also looked at things like service access. So while you may have institutions or people who believe that mental health should be looked at, we had to look at based on resources, on institutional type, whether mental health service access was available and to what extent. And finally, we had to look at institutional differences, as I stated before. The three institutions that we look at are very different. One's a state institution, one is an institution that's also very well endowed, and another serves particularly poor students but comes with a religious mission. These institutional differences will shape the way these institutions, their faculty, their administrative structures view mental health access and the importance of it. Lily?
Yeah, thank you, Lesley. So for any research, you have to have clear research question. So through our literature review and reflection discussion, we have defined 3 key questions. One is, how do faculty experience well-being, burnout, and stressor? And how do those experiences vary by contrast of different type of institution, their ranks, and institution culture? Then the second one is how coping strategies and institutional support, including peer networks and mental health policy, vary by different contract types and campuses. The last one is, where are the gaps between the formal provision of mental health and well-being resources, and actual faculty experience, particularly for contingent and non-tenure faculty. So those research questions guided our interview question, and we have conducted more than 12 interviews, I think, and we also wanted to highlight why we think this particular topic it is important. So the burnout and well-being, they have different factors can have direct impact. So for instance, being with an institution, they could have different contract types. In particular, the short-term contract, that can be a very stress trigger. Also, from different institutions that we had the chance to interview with, they have different institutional mission and governance. Also, the way that they provide support for their faculty member is different. Although all the university in Colombia have some similarities, they also have certain specific cultural perception related to their institutional differences. So we kind of wanted to highlight those. Now, the 3 universities that we had chance to interview, they're 3 distinct different type of institutions. UNIMINUTO is a private Catholic institution. They are very faith-driven. They have strong religious influence. They also have a very wide variety in terms of their campuses. It is nationwide and have 55 different campuses location. They have more than 10,000 students when counting all the campuses, and very unique for their institution. The mission policy is it's open access, and they also have the intention in mind that those campuses was intentionally built in underserved areas that made those vulnerable students have a closer access to them. Their faculty population is around 2,000, and among those, have a little bit more than half they are full-time and the other is part-time. Uniandes is also a private institution, but they are elite. They have the nickname of Colombia Harvard. So they really kind of ranking themselves in a very elite format, and they have very intensive research focus. For them, they have urban campus and also have huge student population as well. They have about 19,000 students. Their faculty total amount is a little bit less than UNIMINUTO, but it's still close to 1,800. So the last one is UNAL, which is a public national flagship institution. For this institution, they are very highly selective. All the Colombian high school students, they will take an entrance exam, and their admission is targeted for 8 to 10% the top students with those scores. They have large student population, close to 33,000, and they have the highest faculty member as well, 3,000, with 2/3 for the full-time and the other 1/3 is part-time. So next slide, please. So I think, as you can see, the 3 institutions that we have selected and have the chance to visit them, they really have their uniqueness. And I think on top of that, we wanted to point out Colombian had a very high bar for themselves, that they wanted to be the most educated country in Latin America. And with that in mind, you can imagine that they also have added stress for their faculty condition. So I think next I'm going to hand it over to Morgan as she's going to dive into more research details.
Thanks, Lily. And before I get into some of the details about data collection, just maybe a little bit of a peek behind the curtain in terms of our process. Prior to actually going down and starting to collect data in Colombia, we had a great opportunity to meet with administrators and leaders at each of the 3 institutions that Lily just took us through to preview our research questions and also some of the potential interview approaches that we wanted to take to get feedback. And I think one of the most important pieces of that process was also validating. Our topic was a critical one for all 3 institutions, and there was a lot of support behind getting to some of the answers around some of these research questions. So just wanted to share that because it was a really critical part of our process. And as Lily noted, at all 3 institutions, we conducted interviews with faculty members and administrators. And we had support from interpreters, which I think is a really important item to know. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. And as Lesley mentioned earlier, our goal was to center faculty voices, focusing on stressors and coping strategies, perceptions of institutional supports that were provided at each university, while also seeking the perspective of administrators of each of these institutions on policy, some of the programming already in place, and communication and supports for faculty to take advantage of them. But of course, there's, in going through the process, there were critical ethical and practical considerations that we had to focus in on. First, just giving the sensitivity around mental health and wellness, our top priority was ensuring confidentiality and care in our interviews and data handling. So we had both kind of a mixture of one-on-one interviews and then some group interviews, and definitely try to tailor those environments to ensure that everyone that participated felt very comfortable. Also, Lesley noted this, as U.S. higher ed based practitioners and students, we really wanted to approach this work with cultural humility, recognizing that we were outsiders to the country, to the institutions, and really own that up front. And so we partnered very closely with Colombian University faculty and leaders to build trust and to adapt our interview kind of process and tools, both for linguistic context and to ensure accuracy. We'll talk later in the presentation about this, but at the end of the entire process, we had an opportunity to present to members of all 3 university communities and beyond who participated in this process. But really, the interpreters were very special. We developed close relationships with them while we were in Colombia, and we had to really trust them to help interpret, both answers to questions we were asking, intent behind those, and help us understand some of the cultural considerations that we just were not privy to or understood fully. And so I think Lily, Lesley, and I, and the interpreters in several occasions really entered into reflexive debriefs throughout the process to ensure that we were remaining grounded and responsive and respectful, and truly were able to understand each of the conversations and interviews that we were having. Just a little bit about the comparative framework throughout this process. So Lily took us through all 3 institutions that we looked at, but just to take that a bit deeper, there's other comparisons that we looked at. So first, comparing faculty and administrators within each institution. We were interested in that dynamic and relationship. Second, also analyzing differences between the institutions. As you can see through the characteristics that we highlighted, major differences in terms of students they're serving, populations, geographic considerations, and the like. And then third, examining cross-cutting factors such as contract type, academic rank, workload, and institutional culture. This in particular was feedback we received from the Colombian leaders and administrators we initially met with prior to going to Colombia, as they were very interested in this aspect. We won't go into a ton of detail about this here, But through the lit review, I think what we identified that was quite interesting is academic rank in Colombia is not just controlled at an institutional level, but it's at a national level. So there is added pressure both for national funding considerations from research all the way through potential other kind of funding to offset student costs around how many faculty at specific ranks do institutions have, and faculty compensation through a national review process was also a pressure early on we identified on faculty. So with that framework in place, we'll now begin to share some of our findings that came to light. So Lily's going to walk us through our analysis of UNIMINUTO.
Thank you, Morgan. Yeah, we can advance to the next slide. So, yes. So, as Morgan mentioned, we intentionally identified the comparative framework, and the comparison between faculty and administrator is a very meaningful comparison. So from UNIMINUTO, we basically asked them a list of questions, and we summarized the theme from the burnout experience, institutional support, personal coping and resilience, and candid reflection in this 4 category. As you can see that they all acknowledge, there is similarity in terms of there is spiritual influence, and that is acknowledged in UNIMINUTO. At the same time, that they have different view in terms of whether or not that the existing support is sufficient or not. From faculty's perspective, they think some of those support is very symbolic. It's very spotty. And what they are looking for, it is more structured and the more comprehensive access. So they kind of named a few very candid reflection, such as they would like to have workload relief. They need to have a more clear defined role, what the faculty's main responsibility should be. I think what we learned from UNIMINUTO is because they're so mission driven and they're very intertwined with community, faculty not only feeling that they need to teach, but they're also responsible to kind of helping students to success in the classroom and outside of the classroom. We had the chance to actually visit some of their incubator, and their education have a clear kind of career orientation goal that they wanted to help students to land somewhere so that their situation can be further improved. So all those institution complexity added to the faculty's pressure to themselves. On the other hand, from the administrator perspective, that they are providing support, and they also have certain maybe designed program that they felt it's helpful for faculty, but it's not very well communicated. So the faculty was kind of be left thinking there more can be done, but administrator is more thinking that they have taken a lot of things into consideration, and the spiritual purpose and the sense of purpose can strengthen the support for faculty members. So next, I'm going to hand it back to Morgan to talk about Uniandes.
Thanks, Lily. I do want to stay on the picture for just a second. This is the only campus, and Lily pointed this out earlier, that has a residential component in the entire country of Colombia. So that was a pretty significant cultural difference for us, and I think impacts in terms of student and faculty relationships on campus in comparison to some of the other campuses. Just give me one second. We met with faculty and administrators specifically at the urban campus of Uniandes. And as Lily noted earlier, this is, again, a private prestigious institution in Bogota, that's often referred to as like the Harvard of Bogota. So really high expectations across the board in terms of academic excellence, high faculty autonomy, and we really found a unique tension between professional freedom of faculty and then internalized pressure, right? Not necessarily maybe pressure they were feeling from the institution or either at a national level, as I noted, but particularly within themselves to want to meet particular expectations of maybe their peers or the institution itself based on the reputation. And so we really were able to hear directly from faculty on their process of navigating promotion demands and workload expectations. Burnout really was most pronounced here among junior faculty. Maybe to no surprise, and that's definitely a theme we'll get into in a little bit as we look at themes across institutions. But again, really driven by that internalized pressure. Junior faculty tend to have heavier teaching workloads, but also with a lot of the research expectations to meet specific rank promotion demands and just the pursuit of excellence in their role and having a national reputation as a faculty member. So administrators acknowledged burnout across ranks and really noted, I think, importantly, that post-COVID student needs in the classroom and beyond have been more demanding of time and emotional energy from faculty, which they felt really were intensifying stresses for faculty. Very comprehensive suite of wellness supports we found at Uniandes at the university level. Both faculty and administrators recognized this, but also recognized barriers specifically to the faculty population for engagement with some of these supports. So faculty were very aware in the conversations we had about resources, but cited lack of time and incentives to engage as major obstacles. And administrators also echoed this. I think there was almost a feeling in some of our conversations of like disappointment, right? Because there was a sense of pride of we have all of these things available, but we don't see a lot of faculty necessarily engaging with them, which we'll talk a little bit, but that's a major gap across several of the institutions. One of the items that we pulled out specifically around low participation was a need for clear, more consistent communication across academic disciplines. Because of the autonomy that exists at the institution, a lot of communications and supports around taking advantage of programming was specific to colleges and departments, and there was not consistent encouragement and support at that level for seeking use of some of the programming. In terms of coping, faculty really expressed leaning more on personal strategies such as exercise, peer support, and then again, that professional autonomy. And administrators, however, emphasize importance of developing culturally responsive wellness models that reflect faculty lived experience. So again, a major gap in terms of what was being offered versus maybe what faculty were taking advantage of. But both groups agreed that it's not working. So change was needed institutionally. Faculty brought up in conversations the desire to have more structured mentorship to help navigate promotion pathways, while administrators expressed more of a willingness to reframe some of the institutional supports around faculty needs in order to drive higher levels of engagement in this programming. So as we've seen at Uniandes, even in well-resourced, very well-resourced institutions, faculty well-being was deeply shaped by internal pressures and structural dynamics. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lesley, who's going to talk a little bit about our findings at UNAL.
Thank you, Morgan. Stay on this picture just a little bit, go back. So what UNAL very significant, and it's very similar here in the United States. This is the public university system. And if you look at your bottom right side, that's the law school. And you see the graffiti there. UNAL is actually the center in the 1960s and the 1970s. A lot of your protest movements with regards to labor rights, student rights, rights of poor people, very similar to the United States' Poor People's Campaign, occurred here on this campus. I mention that because that's some of the pressures that add to faculty burnout that we're seeing throughout time. So if we move to the next screen, one of the things that we saw that was a difference between faculty, where when it came to pressure, pressure occurred or high level occurred among those faculty members who were adjunct, who still did not have contracts, but were looking to get those contracts, and faculty members who already have tenure. The thing what's happening in Colombia is that research is, because the state does not provide a lot of dollars to the colleges and universities with regards to research. Faculty members who are looking to make names for themselves are encouraged not only by the institution, but internally speaking, to make a name for yourself, you are required to go do research and to raise your own dollars. As one faculty member told us, that once you get tenure, technically speaking, you can be very comfortable there. But if you want to make a name for yourself, if you want to have a reputation for yourself, the best bet is for you to go and raise your own dollars. Hence, very high levels of stress and not much effort or time to do anything else aside from your own coursework. On the other end of the extreme, of course, we have adjunct faculty members who are not certain about their contracts. Because of that, there's the additional stress of things like healthcare, pay. There is uncertainty level there. So those are where we found the two major stressors to be among faculty. One of the things the faculty talked about also too was that when it came to resources that were available to them, because this was a state institution, there was a lot of facility work that had not been done. And where the mental health facilities were located on campus, they were specific to students, faculty could use them, but there's also a stigma that is part of this. That stigma of not being able to cope, of needing help, is a very real thing. And if you are a faculty member who is looking for help, there's only one space that you can go for this help. So as a result of that, for what other reason would you need to be in this building? If you're not there for students, you're there for mental health support, which can be, as one faculty member put it, rather embarrassing. And as a result, a lot of faculty members, particularly those who are higher stressed, tend to be self-reliant. We had one faculty member who talked extensively about how wonderful the gym was, because that's where he was actually able to do for himself for his own mental health well-being. So to what we saw, there were very candid reflections with regards to not only as faculty members being responsible for their own research, they're also being responsible for students and students' own well-being. Because of cutbacks with regards to staff, faculty members are now finding themselves being not only academic advisors, but they're also being psychological advisors. They're now also being responsible for letting students know where they can get mental health services, even if they themselves do not necessarily know. One of the things that a faculty member discussed, a senior faculty member, that one of the things that provided additional stress for faculty was the change in education, in higher education in particular, moving away from an academic model in where students are coming to the institution to learn from faculty, to more of a consumer model in education, and where, because higher education is looking to be competitive, because of the need to fill seats, colleges and universities, particularly on the public sector, are looking to get students. They are treating students as consumers. And because of the consumer mentality, we have faculty members who actually express that they are not always able to say what it is that they want to say in a classroom setting without feeling that they themselves could be censored. It was something that was actually rather unique that we had not heard at the other institutions, even though there was a recognition that students' mental health in terms of the investment in it, was something that became priority for institutions, even though there was a recognition that that was needed by faculty as well as administration. Now, when it came to the administrative perspective, they saw burnout, but more as a structural issue, meaning that if you wanted to address burnout, you had to deal with things such as contracts, how contracts came about, when do contracts get settled, and more importantly, there was labor issues that were involved as well. If you have people who do not have access to their contracts, you're now also dealing with the additional stress of not only mental health, but who's going to pay for it. So in the state system, what you have is state regulated dollars as to regarding medical health and whether mental health was actually being seen as something that should be taken care of as part of your medical package. That's an additional stressor. That's a structural one that has yet to be really addressed. When we looked at, I think they all agreed that there was a lot of well-meaning work that was done towards student health, but there seemed to be a gap in terms of information. Students are given this consumer model. Students are being told where they can. It is something that is built into the system for them. And one of our faculty members did say rather candidly that if the university thought that mental health was something that could be and ought to be addressed, then it should be built into the calendar. It should be built into the schedule. So it's not something that is seen as an option, but something that the university actually supports and will give time to and actually pay for you to do. So I think at the end of the day, what we found was there was an encouragement towards mental health support, but because of structural issues and because we're talking about a public institution, they are not only dealing with the internalized pressures that are brought between the different factions within an institution, they're also dealing with the external pressures brought on by politics, as well as the need, this mandate to have a better, more well-educated society, as well as students who can drive economic development.
Thanks so much, Lesley. So now we're going to look a little bit across each of these institutions and you've probably pulled some themes already together as you've heard us talk about all three. We found and confirmed that burnout was common, especially among, as I mentioned earlier, early career and adjunct faculty. And while supports like wellness programs might exist, faculty really expressed to us they consistently wanted them, as Lesley just noted, integrated in core pieces of academic life. So when we were trying to pull that out a bit, what does that look like? You know, how does that manifest specifically for you? That was inclusion of time specifically, right, for faculty to take care of themselves in any way that they identified appropriate through annual workload plans and not being treated as Lesley noted optional or as an add-on. The other piece too that I just want to note is obviously there's a lot of cultural sensitivity to mental health, as we've noted, similar to the US and Colombia. And so faculty were very open to say, I don't necessarily want to have a conversation with my supervisor about my plans on wellness and mental health supports, but I do want them to acknowledge that time is necessary to take care of myself in this way. So time constraints, incentive gaps, and really faculty self-reliance on culture hindered usage of formal institutional supports and systems and programming, as we've noted across all three institutions. So there definitely was opportunity at an institutional and administrator level to address some of these issues. Although institutional mission helped to sustain and motivate many faculty, right? We heard time and time again, faculty love their jobs and their students. It was not necessarily enough to prevent burnout. In many instances, I think we felt like the exact opposite, right? It was contributing to because they were putting everything they had into their work. So having explored each institution individually, we want to turn to some of the patterns that emerged across all three. Lesley's going to lead us through some of those shared themes and key differences on how burnout is experienced and understood across institutional context.
Thank you. So as we noted before, institutional type, but also institutional culture, as well as the student population that attends, actually are all interrelated into what we consider in terms of burnout and well-being. So, for example, when we look at something like when we talk about institutional culture, a place like UNIMINUTO that is religiously based, mission-driven, saw stress as something literally like a necessary evil. They understood that it was something that was going to happen because of the large amount of campuses that it has. It has 55 campuses throughout the country. But because there is a spiritual mission behind it, it is the price that it is literally the labor of love that mitigates high levels of stress. But there is also a recognition that it does need to be provided for, versus Uniandes, which is again the Harvard of Colombia. It is very well funded. It has their own institutional structures, and autonomy is something that is highly praised among the faculty. But because of that autonomy, because faculty members are expected to produce, bring in funds, and maintain the institutional reputation, pressure is increased. And there is a recognition that there needs to be things that allow faculty members to maintain their autonomy, but at the same time, be willing to come back to campus, be willing to come back to the institution for institutional support. When we look at things like stressors, and contract influence we found to be highly interrelated. If you did not have a contract, or if your contract was pending, that caused a lot of stress. And until you got your contract resolved, and until you understood how you were being paid and what benefits you were going to have, you suffered high levels of stress. On the other end of the extreme, with regards to a place like UNAL, you can have a contract, but if you are looking to build an institutional reputation or a national reputation that goes beyond your institution, your stress levels are going to be much higher, simply because, and that's contract type, simply because you want to be able to show that you are not only proven that you can be a full-time vested faculty member, but you also have a reputation that takes you beyond the institution. So all these things play different parts of the of what we consider to be burnout versus what is also considered to be a stressor. I think one of the things that what we did note was that faculty members had their own sense of burnout and stress, meaning that for some faculty members, particularly faculty members at places like UNIMINUTO and I'm sorry, at UNAL and Uniandes, stress for some faculty members was not necessarily considered to be a negative thing. In many cases, stress for them was the impetus for them to move forward, not only in terms of their contract negotiations, but the kind of scholar that they wanted to be. So when we thought about stress and when we went into our conversations about stress and burnout, we had to make the acknowledgement that for some people, stress is not a negative thing. I think what we also found, that just in talking with the experts about burnout and about mental health and well-being, is how do we convince those same faculty members at what point does that quote unquote positive stressor become something that can become a problem? Because at the end of the day, as one of our experts said, you will tell a highly stressed professor by the way that professor interacts with their students and what the students say about that particular professor. And it's at that point that those intercessions on behalf of the institution can be made with the faculty member. But until that happens, many times you don't know. So when we talk about burnout and well-being, we're realizing that this is just as much a very subjective thing as it is as things that can be tested empirically or through qualitative data. So I'm going to turn it back over to Morgan so she could talk about the institutional supports.
Thanks, Leslie. I really think that last point you made was so critical too, in terms of some of our findings in this process, that stress is expected and stress management really is the conversation. But at all three institutions, offered wellness programming. So I think there was a general acknowledgement across all three. It is critical. They felt institutionally, based on their mission and their desired environment and supports for faculty and staff and students, that wellness programming was critical, but access and engagement to that programming looked very different in practice. So at UNIMINUTO, supports included wellness weeks, workshops, so a lot of focus on education of wellness, but yet many faculty leaned much more heavily onto their personal faith and their family as really the primary source of well-being and coping. At UNAL, similar programming existed, but participation, especially among adjuncts, was low and often dependent on contract status, as you've all heard. And adjuncts not currently under contract, in many instances, were not eligible at all for formal supports. At Uniandes, there are more formalized wellness initiatives such as mindfulness training and strategic wellness programs. However, we heard time and time again that the time constraints really were the major barrier for faculty engagement. Across all sites, disparities in access persisted, particularly again for our adjunct and early career faculty. From an administrator perspective, UNIMINUTO connects wellness to its spiritual mission, understandably, and we heard that from faculty and administrators. UNAL highlighted a need for more funding and structural reform. That's based on really both lack of funding to start with and then cuts they had experienced that they had shared with us. And at Uniandes, focus on improving communication and campus culture was really a focus from an administrator perspective. So with all of those institutional contexts in mind, Lily's going to really help us explore how the faculty themselves are coping with burnout.
Thank you, Morgan. So when we're talking about coping strategy, using the comparable framework, we also had the faculty view and the administrative view so that you can see the difference. One thing that both parties that they acknowledge is pandemic COVID really worsened the stress and making faculty well-being like more difficult to manage, because in a way that the disruption itself not only impacted the classroom, but also impacted some of students' behavior, and the faculty was concerned and then have to input more in order to keep the same learning level. Now, for faculty, they have identified a lot of the primary coping is, through family, through peer support, and spiritual. Administrators, they actually think university have a lot of supports that can be used as a primary coping, but unfortunately, both Lesley and Morgan talked about there are some communication labs that not all program that university put together is well known to faculty. So more or less, they are still just struggle by themselves. And I think the other important factor is take time to do self-care. Now, although the administrator, they acknowledge that it's important, faculty should take time to take care of themselves, but at the same time, it is very hard to have the structural changes to the faculty, like their evaluation or framework. Therefore, from faculty perspective, that they are very tight in terms of the responsibility itself and the time that they can allocate for this. Especially if they are adjunct professor, then they have very limited care a limited time that they can spend on self-care. It's always going to be like on the clock to do something. So I think next I'm going to give it back to Morgan that she will share additional perspective from both faculty and administrator point of view.
Thanks, Lily. And I'm just noting time. So I might speed through this a little bit so we can get to some of the important stuff in terms of wrap up. But I think, as we've noted, right, like that there's a contrast between faculty and administrators and their perspective on kind of burnout and programming. Faculty identified burnout as rooted in workload. In some institutions, it was related to some of the bureaucracy. And also isolation, feeling kind of alone, and kind of on, so there's autonomy, but also feeling isolation in that autonomy. And their coping strategies across the board were very personal at every institution between spirituality, exercise, or some of the peer supports that they were seeking. And then in contrast, administrators tended to burnout as shaped by funding constraints and the rising student needs that we've expressed, especially since COVID. So their focus was more on formal interventions like workshops and policies and improving participation and communication in those areas. So we do feel strongly that there's contribution to practice and policy opportunities. And in particular, kind of these 4 areas I think really stood out to us in understanding potential highlights of contributions to faculty well-being in Colombia. First, importance of capturing faculty voices across institutional lines was, incredibly insightful and revealed shared experiences and also site-specific nuances between these institutions. Talking with faculty and administrators also helped us understand a grounding foundation for policies and the lived conditions of faculty versus assumptions that we naturally could have made just by going through a literature review, especially around burnout and well-being. And third, definitely the cross-campus equity and access to mental health and supports, particularly for adjuncts and early career faculty, was pronounced in all of our conversations. I think one of the potential impacts or contributions that we identified too is this broader conversation, not just within Colombia, but being able to apply what is happening in Colombia around health, around wellness and mental health to more of a global dialogue. So I will turn it over to Lily, who's gonna take us home.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Morgan. So I think for the recap, I think there are many things that you already see. It is covered by our summary in terms of our findings. One particular thing that I'm going to highlight is even though if different institutions have their own struggle, there is a bigger factor that it's outside of the institution in terms of the political environment. And that itself can impact the funding depending on the relationship between the institution and the political party. One interesting observation was when we were there during summertime, it's supposed to be their summer break, but because the students in UNAL, the National University of Colombia, they had so many protests, there's some classroom activity was delayed. So we actually experienced that they're doing the classroom learning when we were doing the visit, which was mentioned by some faculty member. So I think overall, there are certain things that, it is pretty obvious that for those faculty that they are struggling with multitasking, they're teachers, they're researchers, they're administrators. At the same time, they also wanted to create opportunity for students after their graduation. So it is a very comprehensive structure that is not one single thing to be said about what brings faculty stress. I think given that context, I'm going to invite Lesley to do a comparison, what happened in Colombia and what happened in US, and what's the similarity and difference.
Thank you. I think at the end of the day, when we look at the implications for U.S. higher education, you have to understand that when we did this trip in July. And the focus was trying to figure out how can we contribute to the gap in understanding of mental wellness and mental well-being for Colombia and for the literature. Since that time, the political dynamics in the United States have changed. And that was part of the underpinnings of some of the conversations that we had in Colombia. Since that time, we've seen higher education in the United States come under more intense scrutiny than it's ever done before. We have a political environment and where colleges and universities are being asked to assume positions that may not necessarily reflect their missions. Threats to financial aid for students, threats to research aid for colleges and universities, and even threats to the ways in which colleges and universities choose its own student populations based on their own reputations and missions. So with that said, we recognize that higher education in the United States, mental health, well-being, and stressors are just as important here. And so the question then became for us in terms of future considerations, how can we better evaluate and integrate wellness programming into our institutions? How can we embed wellness as part of our own faculty workload? And more importantly, we are not isolated onto ourselves into the United States. How do we foster better global collaborations towards solving similar problems that are politically based, but are dealing with different cultural stressors? So, with that said, we open this for conversation. We open this for future research, and we thank you for allowing us to be able to participate in this very important conversation.
Lesley, thanks so much, and Lily and Deb. We did not allow for much time for Q&A, but we're happy to stay on. And also, I'll pull up a slide that includes our email addresses in case folks want to reach out after this, since we just have a couple minutes. Oh, Deb, you're muted.
If anybody has any questions, now's the time, post them in the chat or come on and speak quickly. You guys have covered some amazing information and sharing, and the pictures just bring your story and your experience to life. So thank you for sharing. But
I'd
we
like
do-
to echo Deb's sentiments
Mhm.
about this important work that you're doing, and we're so honored to host this presentation at the Teaching and Learning Conference. Any surprises out of your research?
Haley, we had like a very similar question in the report out that we did to the university communities at the end of the process. And I think one of the surprises, but also it was incredible to see, is some of the institutions they integrate like their student affairs and faculty affairs offices. So wellness and mental health supports are all in one, right? It's not considered maybe like a student issue over here and then a faculty issue over here, but those offices work hand in hand. And while there might be different programming and folks that are supporting different audiences, they're all together as one because they consider like classroom wellness one umbrella topic. So that was pretty cool to see and start to unpack at some of the institutions. And I'll hand it over to Lily and Lesley for others.
Well, I think I will comment on something just from observation, how each individual institution is a little different. I think when we were there, when we were having the interview, at UNIMINUTO, they actually intentionally invited students to be the translator. So their faculty member actually only speaks Spanish, and the student who is majoring in English, that they're so eager to help us. And at the same time that I think they take their job so seriously, sometimes they're going to pause us, say, let me translate again, because I don't think I captured the whole meaning of it. And I think that enthusiasm, it's something that is wonderful to see.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think, and this would, I wouldn't say it's more of a surprise, but it was something that was heartening. After we did our presentation, we got a chance to do a question and answer and moved about. And one of the institutional psychologists who worked at UNAL came up to me and started crying. And she didn't, her English, she was always, she was apologetic for her English, and I don't know why, but the one thing that she said that she, for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. That the work that she was doing was not only viewed as important, but was worthy of research. And she was not the only one who made that comment. So I found that to be not just only very surprising, but I think affirming that what we were doing was important.
That's very moving, and thank you all for sharing. And Lily, what a unique experience to translate a faculty member's perspective through a student lens. That's sort of doing things in my brain right now. And then Morgan, I so appreciate that a holistic look at classroom wellness and the integration there and how that might shape approaches or resources or different perspectives. Thank you all for sharing.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity. It's a wonderful platform. It's my first time to heard about the conference. So thank you, Morgan, and thank you everyone to make this happen.
Well, I hope we will see you all next year.
Thank you for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Morgan, Lily, and Lesley. Wonderful presentation. And thank you to the audience for coming and enjoying this session. And please complete the survey link that's included in the chat and help us finish out a strong TLC this afternoon.